Good morning and welcome to this webinar. It's a Friday morning in a strange season and we're starting a little late, but here we are. We're so glad at this point to be starting this webinar, which has been organized to mark the beatification of the Salvadoran Jesuit, Father Rutilio Grande. My name is David Collins. I'm the Haub Director of Catholic Studies and a history professor at Georgetown University. This webinar is being co-sponsored at Georgetown by the Catholic Studies Program, the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Americas Institute, and the Office of Mission and Ministry. The webinar is being recorded, and the captioned video will be posted to the events page on the Berkeley Center's website soon. If you registered for today's event, you will also receive an email with the captioned video when it becomes available. In the last 15 minutes or so, we will take questions from the audience. Please join the conversation by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing your question. On March 12, 1977, Father Grande was driving from one parish church in his care to another to celebrate Mass. With him in the VW Safari were his sacristan, the 72-year-old Manuel Solorzano, and a 15-year-old helper, Nelson Rutilio Lemos. Not far into the trip, their route passed through cane fields. It was there that the three were ambushed and gunned down. The attack team, as can best be reconstructed, included Salvadoran National Guardsmen and a customs officer. Forensic doctors later removed 12 9mm rounds from Father Grande's body. Manuel and Nelson were also killed in the attack. The local bishop, Oscar Romero, celebrated the funeral mass 2 days later. His funeral homily became the first in a series of 5 sermons in which the Archbishop drew connections between Father Grande's life, work, and death, and Pope Paul VI's recent exhortation that the Church be present in the struggle for liberation from human misery. Exactly why Father Grande was singled out for assassination is a question without a definitive answer. Father Grande had long organized base ecclesial communities that catechized poor, marginalized, and exploited populations in Christian faith and encouraged them that working for human rights and dignity was part of Christian discipleship. His longtime work with campesinos had been of the kind that inspired his Jesuit order's new expression of purpose in 1974, that the service of faith includes, as an absolute requirement, the promotion of justice. While the Salvadoran Church was divided on such questions, political autocrats and landowning oligarchs were demanding the restraint of clergy like Father Grande. In the weeks before his murder, 4 other priests were expelled from the country, still more arrested and tortured for preaching and working just like Father Grande. As political violence became an increasingly destabilizing part of Salvadoran life, civil war broke out in 1979 between a right-wing military junta and a coalition of left-wing political organizations. This 12-year war left 75,000 non-combatants dead, 8,000 people were disappeared, a full million out of a population of 4.5 million were displaced, half internally, half as international refugees. Among the non-combatant dead numbered 18 priests, 1 archbishop, 5 religious sisters, and hundreds of lay catechists. 6 of those priests were Father Grande's fellow Jesuits, similarly killed by a death squad at the university in San Salvador in 1989. The Archbishop, assassinated in March 1980, is of course Oscar Romero, whom Pope Francis canonized in 2018. Pope Francis has also called the stealing effect that Father Grande's murder had on Archbishop Romero the Jesuit priest's first miracle. Tomorrow in San Salvador, Rutilio, Manuel, and Nelson will be declared blesseds of the Catholic Church, a beatification that is the occasion for our gathering this morning. Beatification and canonization are designations the Catholic Church gives to those who, by a virtuous life or courageous death, signal the fullness of Christian discipleship. Given how few Christians are ever singled out this way, the social and religious historian is always quick to wonder why this person and why now? What is worth remembering and why? What fruit, as St. Ignatius might put it, can be drawn from it? That's the prompt for our discussion this morning. And our panel is especially suited to reflect on such questions. Each panelist has a connection to the Salvadoran history that Father Grande draws our attention to, and all of them has let that connection shape their lives and commitments to the present moment. Furthermore, each makes this connection with a different expertise or profession or vocation, as it were, making this an especially promising panel for a multidisciplinary program like Catholic Studies to host. And so a few words of introduction to our panelists. We are joined by a poet. Professor Carolyn Forché, a member of our English department, is a poet and human rights activist. Her recent work, What You Have Heard Is True, a memoir of witness and resistance, is a reflection on her experience in the late 70s and 80s in El Salvador. We are joined by a theologian, Father David Hollenbach. He is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. His teaching and research deal with human rights, religious and ethical responses to humanitarian crises, and religion and political life from the standpoint of Catholic social thought. Next, a community organizer. Abel Nunez is the executive director of the Central American Resource Center here in the District of Columbia. CARACEN promotes grassroots empowerment, civic engagement, and civil rights advocacy within DC's Latino community. Abel migrated with his family from El Salvador to the United States in 1979 and grew up in Washington. In 2017, he was awarded Georgetown's John Thompson Jr. Legacy of a Dream Award. Last, and certainly not least, two public servants. Congressman Juan Vargas has represented California's 51st Congressional District since 2012. His district is the state's southernmost and includes all of California's border with Mexico. The son of Mexican immigrants, Paco was for several years in the 1980s a Jesuit, and during that time he was assigned to work with disadvantaged communities in the jungles of El Salvador. We also hope to be joined perhaps midway by Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. Jim is best known in Jesuit circles for having been in 1990 charged as a congressional staffer to lead the House task force investigating the 1989 murder of 6 Jesuits and 2 laywomen at the UCA El Salvador. To all 4 of you, thank you so much for coming this morning. Let's start with the history and your personal experience of it. Perhaps we can start with you, Carolyn. Could you share some of your experience and the strong impression of El Salvador that you have still today, your experience in the 70s and 80s?
Thank you for having me here. I arrived in El Salvador 9 months after Padre Grande's murder. By then, another priest, Padre Navarro, had also been killed, and in those months, 300 campesinos had lost their lives. 40 Catholic nuns had been deported, all clergy, religious, catechists, and laity, who responded to the calls to live the gospel of Christ, to work on behalf of justice, were considered then subversives, as was anyone else who worked with and among the poor for a more equitable society. These included doctors, teachers, nurses, social workers, union organizers, college and high school students, all who were active in the popular organizations and Christian-based communities. All were called subversives. All were considered to be communist, no matter their political views. And at that time, the military and security forces and their civilian death squad counterparts marked subversives for death. Imagine yourself in such a situation. You might imagine terror, and it is true there was always fear. It was the air we breathed. You might imagine that it would be difficult to keep doing the work despite this fear, that you might be tempted to pull back, to hide, or even to leave the country. You might imagine becoming hypervigilant, always aware of your surroundings, wary of being watched or followed. And it was true. In 1977, the death squads did their work even in broad daylight. By a year or so after Padre Grande's death, more than 1,000 people a month were being murdered or disappeared. The mutilated bodies were left in the open, on doorsteps and city streets, in fields, and on ranches and farms, all to instill terror. These imaginings might lead you to wonder why people stayed and kept working, why they worked even harder, and why they continually risked death. It is understandable to wonder these things if you were not there at the time, if you did not experience the grace that flooded the campo, the villages and towns, the churches and the base communities, if you did not come to realize that all were your brothers and sisters, those standing with you at Mass in an unfinished cathedral, or in a field in the campo where Mass was set on a boulder, spread with an altar cloth, that these brothers and sisters were willing to die for each other and for you. Yes, it is a strange sensation to realize this. They blessed and strengthened each other with their love and gave each other hope and courage to face whatever might come. And that they would freely give this hope and courage also to you. I remember the very night when I first realized things had changed deeply within me, that I hoped I wasn't going to be too tired to do something ever again, that I wasn't going to worry so much about myself. I had never experienced the living church before that time, and it was a revelation. I had been born and raised Catholic. I had attended Catholic school for 12 years. I thought I knew what the church was, but I also thought that Vatican II was about saying Mass in English with the priest facing the people. And I had never heard of the Conference of Medellin. I would learn about the institutional violence and systemic poverty and the church's call to act in the world according to the teachings of Christ while experiencing the living church for the first time. Once I knew where I was and what was happening and what it meant and required of us, I still felt afraid, as everyone did. But the fear did not overcome the grace, even in the worst of moments. I understand if you might think that from a distance of 45 years, I may be remembering things as other than they actually were. But I assure you, nothing has mattered more to me than utter clarity regarding that time and place. I never knew Padre Grande personally, but I knew those he had touched, the people of his parish, those he had inspired to live and not just to read the word of God. I came to know other priests and nuns and laity who had chosen the preferential option for the poor, which meant not only to work with the poor, but to live as they live and to share their fate. Some did not live to see the 12-year war that broke the repression, ended military rule, and was concluded in a negotiated peace. That war cost the lives of 75,000 civilian non-combatants, and an untold number have disappeared. I remember that there were two Catholic churches then. What we called the popular church, made up of the people working for justice, and what we called the institutional church, that thought itself apart from all worldly concerns. I remember body dumps at Puerto del Diablo and El Playón. I remember searching for bodies on the beach and in the campo and in those dumps. I remember witnessing an abduction when a young student with a rucksack was grabbed in the street and shoved into a van, never to be seen again. And all of this was before the war was said to have begun. Many things I remember, but mostly the eyes of the people, of my friends, the light that held steady in their eyes when we thought our time might be up. During the most harrowing of times, without knowing if or whether the end would come, that is when we together knew the radiance of souls in community, as Padre Grande did, a grace that was always among us, should we realize who we actually are to each other. And it is always here, and it is always possible.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Let's turn a similar question or the same question to Abel. Abel, Salvador in the 70s was your home, and you have clearly an experience of home in the 70s. We from the States, our attention was drawn to it. You were there. What of your experience stays with you?
My experience is a little bit different, that I came sort of to know Rutilo Grande after the fact. As a young boy living in El Salvador in the 70s, I could only see what was happening in the reflections of my parents and the adults around me. I remember before we left the country, beginning to hear of incidents of clashes between the military in the guerrilla. It was really foreign to me. I was, my life at that time were my parents. I remember immigrating to the U.S. and while here, seeing the shock of my parents and my grandmother when Monsignor Romero, now San Romero, was assassinated, and what that meant to them, an experience outside of myself, because I did not understand what that was as a young person growing up, struggling with integrating into a new home, and just seeing the images of when the cathedral was taken over and all of the news that was coming out that was filtered really through an American media that did not know the area and did not know the history. And I remember as a teenager going back to El Salvador and being stopped at military, patrols, getting taken out of a car and asking for IDs while we had done nothing, with very high power weapons pointed at us. But again, an experience where my parents or the adults around me were the ones that were negotiating those spaces. But I think that when I started working in community here in the U.S., and in great part was because of the challenges that my parents and I face here, that I felt compelled to work in community, trying to ensure that the immigrants coming, right, to this, particularly the Washington, D.C. area, how do we help them integrate? I remember being a ninth grader and seeing this massive influx of Salvadorian, students coming in and not understanding why. But as an adult, as a young adult, beginning to work in community, I think part of it is because the Washington, D.C. area also has the second largest population of Salvadorians in the U.S., beginning to meet people that were involved in the solidarity movement and understanding what they have lived through, and to know that the work that I was beginning to do in the U.S. was connected to a work that has started in El Salvador. And it really, if you think about it, has started back in the 30s of the Great Matanza in El Salvador, and those legacies of organizing and struggle that had happened. And in a strange way, I was connected to all of that work and had to relearn things that I was not taught, right? Because I did not know of Rutilio until I was an adult working in community in the US, connected to individuals that did know him, that did work with him, and explaining to me how that his life has a direct link to what I was doing currently, helping Salvadoran immigrants integrating into the Washington, D.C. area. And for me, it was first an eye-opener to see that there was this great group of individuals that had struggled, some had died, but were continuing this tradition of organizing, of empowering, the voiceless, and to kind of begin to learn, the writings, listening to the homilies of Monsignor Romero. I did not hear them as when they were being broadcast live. I've heard this after the fact, but then I felt the deep responsibility to go back and learn that history and understand how everything is connected, and why the struggle of what I do, what my organization, the Central American Research Center Carecen does, how they came to exist, why they are incredibly important, and why we have an incredible responsibility to not just celebrate this particular event that's happening this weekend with Rutilio, but to understand the history and the context in which it happened, so that we can understand our current present, right? We can understand the present in El Salvador right now, and we can understand the present here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles, in Boston, Houston, San Francisco, all of those places where there are large Central American communities, and you have the third generation that were born in the U.S. and are void of that history. Because unfortunately, the U.S. is not doing a good job of teaching us what happened, teaching us why it is so important to understand who Rutilio Grande was, and the reasons that he was killed, the reason that Monsignor was killed. We have to remember, all they did was live their convictions of being in community and speaking for the voiceless, and that got them killed. We also have to understand that a lot of the other conditions that led to the mass migration of Salvadorians and other Central Americans to this country has a lot to do with also the policies that were put in place by elected officials in this country that cost that. We have to remember that civil war that Carolyn mentioned that went for 12 years was sponsored by the US at a tune of $1 million a day in military aid. And those have implications. But what have been the consequences and the outcomes? Now, Salvadorians are the second largest Latino group, or I'm sorry, the third largest Latino group in the US. And what I like to say is that the DNA of the US and El Salvador are intertwined, and it can never be undone. We are one, right? And it was because of this oppression, but it also, it's been to a large part of people like Rutilio that were such lights that kept us moving in a direction of justice, right? To keep us working. And whether I was working here in community in Washington, D.C., it is connected. It is hardwired to the work of Monsignor Romero, to the work of Rutilio Grande, to the work of Farabundo Martí, right? That it's all connected and moving us to, fight oppression, fight for the voices, and keep on going. So for me, it serves as a guiding light. What my responsibility is to ensure that light doesn't only shine on me, but it shines on everyone that is impacted, and so that we can continue the legacy of moving forward.
Thank you very much for that, Abel. You've already started even to sketch a question that we're all going to have to return to, which is this issue of what is the legacy of that moment in the 70s and the 80s. Congressman Vargas, you have yet a third a kind of experience of El Salvador, being sent there as an adult Jesuit. What's the baseline of your experience in the 80s that you've carried forward with you?
Sure. Well, back then I was in formation. I was studying to be a Jesuit priest. I had taken vows. I had done my novitiate here in California. And during that time, I had worked with Father Mike Kennedy, who was a Jesuit, is a Jesuit, and was very involved in sanctuary. So come 1986, all us young Jesuits, we all wanted to go to El Salvador. To be truthful, we all wanted to go there because of what had happened. And also because of the UCA there and the Jesuits' presence. There was a very charismatic person named Ignacio Yacuria, who was the rector at the UCA, and we all wanted to work with him. And so I finally got the chance to do that and went down there. And the first thing that happened as a young Jesuit, you have to have a spiritual director. And my spiritual director was a guy named Segundo Montes, one of the Jesuits there, a great guy. Somewhat stern. He was originally from Spain, but all of them had one thing in common, and that was they were so passionate about working with the community. And it was wonderful. I mean, I stayed the first 2 weeks that I was in El Salvador. I stayed with them at the UCA to get acculturated what was going on. And then they sent me to Domas Maria, which was a refugee internally displaced camp. And then I was sent out to Chalatenango, where I stayed the rest of my time there. But I was looking through the things that I have, and I don't have a lot from when I was down there. I do remember this book that was given to me by Segundo Montes when I arrived, and it's Rutilio Grande from the UCA. One of the things that I remember he told me was, don't write many things in there in case you get arrested. You don't want anything that they can use against you to torture you or kill you. Just read it. And so it's interesting. After looking at it again in preparation for today, I thought it is interesting. I normally write in the margins little notes, and I didn't here. Because again, Segundo saying, don't do that because it can really get you in trouble, especially out in Chalatenango. But what I remember most was the commitment of the Jesuits to the community, to the poor, and how the poor responded to that. Really a brotherhood, a sisterhood of people. And again, listening to Ms. Forche was interesting because death was always around you. Everyone was getting killed. I remember the first day that I was at the UCA, literally the first day, very stupidly, I walk out thinking I'm going to go for a jog, and there's literally a young man's body right there, and there's people praying around it. And I didn't know what to think. I'm thinking, my God, I just walked out of this rectory here, this Jesuit rectory, and there's a dead person here, and it looks like his family's around and praying. I didn't know what to do other than, bless myself, walk back in. And I think it was Segundo that I talked to, or it might have been Juan. I remember which was one of the Jesuits. And he said, this happens all the time because these are the students that work with us, and they're called subversives. And then they're murdered. They bring them here, they bring them other places, and the parents and the family can't move the body. It's either the church has to do it or the government, because they were left there for a purpose. So anyway, we went back out and he blessed the body. And of course, it was his family that was out there, the family of the young man. But anyway, that was my first introduction to El Salvador.
Wow.
Here I had worked with refugees through Mike Kennedy, but there it was an interesting time, a very difficult time, but a very beautiful time too. Interesting. Oddly enough, as Ms. Forche said, it was a very beautiful time too.
Thanks very much for that. It's and actually for drawing our attention, the UCA has produced really a large amount of information, both videos and books about Father Grande. We put a few links on the Catholic Studies website for people that after the webinar want to follow up on it. I see Congressman McGovern has joined us. You're moving so fast in the background. Shall we give you a moment to catch your breath? And
I'm fine. I now have a seat.
okay, great. We're just we started a little late, so we're just looking for a real brief sketch of that, your initial experience and exposure to El Salvador, sort of the history that you encountered, and sort of that has inspired you since, but a real focus on what your connection is in that moment in the 70s and the 80s that of struggle in El Salvador.
Well, in the 1980s, early 1980s, I was a young aide to Congressman Joe Moakley of South Boston. In fact, I'm in South Boston right now. Just came from a funeral mass for one of his former aides. But we had constituents in Massachusetts coming to see Moakley, pleading for his help to help Salvadoran refugees who were fleeing the violence in El Salvador. And Moakley was pretty much a bread and butter politician. And he used to joke that his idea of a foreign policy issue was driving from South Boston to East Boston for an Italian sandwich. And so he called me up. I had just started working for him. This was in early 1983. And he said, people are telling me that things are really bad in El Salvador. What do you know about it? And I said, I just know what I've read. He said, well, why don't you go down and check it out and then report back to me? And so in 1983, I visited El Salvador, not knowing what to expect. And similar to Congressman Vargas, one of my first stops was at the UCA. I was going to meet with Father Ellacuría. We were supposed to meet at a coffee shop. He called me and said that he had received a number of threats. So he would prefer, for my own safety, that we meet on campus, which we did. I also met with Father Martin Barreau. I get to know Segundo Montes very well. And talking about how we can help educate the American people and the U.S. Congress about the harsh realities of El Salvador, how we could change U.S. policy, and how we could protect the Salvadorans who were in the United States. And so that was the first of multiple visits. But I remember Father Ellacuría talking to me about Rutilio Grande, asking me whether I knew the history of the persecution against the church in El Salvador. And to be honest with you, I was a young aide. I didn't know very much about anything. And he told me the story. And he told me the impact that Rutilio Grande's assassination had on the church as a whole, on Archbishop Romero, on all of the work that is being done at the UCA, and said that Rutilio Grande was murdered because of his absolute commitment to the poor. And he says the focus of this university is an absolute commitment to the poor. And the focus of any government ought to be an absolute commitment to the poor. And it exposed me to this whole new kind of interesting take on the church with regard to liberation theology. I'll just confess to you that at that point in my life, I was kind of drifting away from the church, raised a Catholic, but I wasn't feeling it. When I would go to a mass. Being in El Salvador in the 80s helped get me excited about my faith again, because it was about more than ritual. It was about action. That's why Rutilio Grande was murdered. That's why Monsignor Romero was murdered. That is why the Jesuits of the UCA were murdered. So for me, those visits to El Salvador beginning in the early 80s, and again, I was part of the investigation team looking into the murders of the Jesuit priest in 1989. They shaped my politics. They shaped my view of the church, and so I'm for as horrible as the realities were, and believe me, I was shocked and ashamed at U.S. policy during those years. I look back on that as a time that really served as a great inspiration for a lot of the work that I do. So that's how I learned about Rutilio Grande, was from Father Elio Correa, and Father Martin Barreau, and Father Segundo Montes, and I miss those Jesuits very much. They were incredible human beings, and we need to be inspired by them.
Thanks so much, Jim. These last three comments are all showing us that Father Grande's death in 1977 was almost immediately beginning to have an effect. People were remembering his story, retelling the story. David Hollenbach, you were, if I've done my math right, you would have been a formed Jesuit already deep in theology, and from the United States, looking at this. You've since become an eminent theologian of the Catholic social thought. As you think about this history that Father Grande's life and death draws our attention to, what do you remember of that time, and what left an impression on you?
Thank you very much, David. I mean, the impact of the Jesuits from Central America on the Jesuits around the world has been sizable. The commitment to the poor was one of the major emphases that they brought to our 31st General Congregation, which shaped the Society of Jesus's commitment to justice as an expression of Christian faith. The Salvadoran Jesuits had a very important role to play in stimulating Jesuit movement in that direction. I didn't know Rutilio Grande himself. I got to know several of his colleagues, Jesuits, who were themselves subsequently assassinated in El Salvador. I got to know Ignacio Echeverria, who collaborated with us on a project here at Georgetown on human rights in the Americas. And I got to know Ignacio Martin Barreau. But one of the things that stands out about those men that I did know a bit was the way that they would frequently refer both to Archbishop Romero and to the influence of Rutilio Grande on Archbishop Romero. We're here to commemorate, or to anticipate by about 24 hours, the beatification of Rutilio Grande, which is the first or second step toward being declared a saint. And one of the dangers of being declared a saint for many of us is that this can make this person seem distant or irrelevant or something beyond what I'm capable of. But I've been reading extensively about Grande recently, and his biography of Grande by a man named Rodolfo Cardinal, who is another Jesuit, wrote a big 450-page biography of Rutilio Grande. He starts off the book by saying that Grande's holiness, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about beatification, that someone is genuinely holy. He says, Grande's holiness was built on fragility. He was a very human person. His fragility is evident from the fact that he suffered from ill health as a young man. Indeed, he suffered from serious mental health problems. He had a nervous breakdown as a young Jesuit and was hospitalized because of certain psychological problems. But somehow in the midst of that suffering that he himself underwent, he was able to surrender himself to care for those who are similarly fragile. And I think that one of the points that Rodolfo Cardinal makes in the book in the early chapters is that somehow his appreciation of the needs of the poor, he himself came from a poor family, was from that source, but also perhaps from his own struggles, his own suffering. He knew what it was to be a human being struggling. And somehow in the midst of that, he surrendered himself to the point of laying down his life for those who were similarly struggling as he was. He was with them. He was not an elevated superstar. He was an ordinary human being who had also great struggles in his own life. And through that, came to appreciate the needs of those who were similarly struggling. It led him then to a kind of option for those who are vulnerable, those who are struggling, those who are fragile. And that was part of the beginning. Now, another dimension of what he did, though, was he recognized that struggle that many people have has very important political dimensions to it, very important structural issues. John Sobrino, a fellow Jesuit of Grande's who's also in El Salvador, speaks of the capacity of these people like Grande to influence the church as a form of what Sobrino calls political holiness. We don't normally think of holiness as being political. It's usually regarded as otherworldly, but his holiness was based on his response to those in need, which had for him, in the end, very important political dimensions. So the two things that stand out for me as I reflect upon Rutilio Grande on the eve of his beatification is his vulnerability and his political orientation in his vulnerability. Those things make a big difference, it seems. They make him somebody who's relevant to us in the United States today and in a world that's deeply divided today. So those are two things that come to the fore for me today.
Thanks very much, David. In fact, I've been following some of the online conversation over the last few months in anticipation of the beatification of Father Grande, and a number of people have raised this issue about him as a patron for those who are fragile, specifically psychologically fragile, which would make him, in this point, when for the last 2 years we've been under a lot of very peculiar stress and strain, he's especially suited to the present moment. I wonder if maybe I could, because we started a little late, and I do want to leave time for a question or two that's been logged in by listeners, distill the next question to kind of a legacy question. And if I could, I'd like to maybe frame it this way. I'm thinking about my college students, our undergraduates, and thinking that given when they were born, Father Grande's assassination would be roughly like, now this is a very rough estimate, perhaps the Great Depression or the beginning of World War II would be to those of us who are on the panel. And so that's ancient history. As I think about the Great Depression growing up in the 70s and the 80s, that's something you learn in a textbook. You answer a few multiple choice questions about it for the AP exam, and then that's kind of it. I wonder if thinking specifically about an undergraduate and the 2-minute elevator pitch you might give about why this legacy matters. I mean, and this is the other part of a beatification or a canonization. We're taking a historical moment and saying this has a relevance that has a dimension of universality to it. There is a lesson here that can be absorbed and learned from a challenge that can be heard, encouragement that can be heard in all kinds of different situations. So it's what I'm asking a bit is could you articulate, and Dave, you sort of started already in your answer, could the rest of you also offer a sense of, well, what would you tell a college student debate? This is why remembering that history matters. And this is the lesson, even if, I mean, especially if you're interested in Central America, but even if you're not, this is still why you need to pay attention. Paco, could we maybe start with you on that one?
Well, you know, it's interesting, as you were saying this, I was thinking that this summer I took my 17-year-old daughter down to southern Mexico because of, again, all the refugees that are coming through, through Mexico and then to the United States. My older daughter had worked at Casa Cornelia with women and girls that had again been trafficked and are now trying to gain asylum. And the church was so active down there. Once again, the church is very active in the southern part of Mexico. I mean, it was interesting taking her back and looking at it. It was a little bit dangerous because now you have narco traffickers running around and you have a cross current of other kinds of violence. But I told my daughter, I said, look how proud we are of the church here. Once again, working with the very, very poor that are trying to find a place. It's interesting. I live here in San Diego, and it's true that you don't have a war raging in El Salvador and Guatemala as they used to have, but at the same time, you have the same type of poverty, and you have the same people that are really poor and needing help coming. And the church should be active. We should be active in trying to gain asylum for them, allowing them to live a life that's decent and good. I mean, it's the same in so many ways. Maybe and also the violence is high, not like it was back then. But the truth of the matter is that we can get inspired by his life and the life of all the other Jesuits and nuns and campesinos that were killed, and say, how can we better their lives and better our own lives by helping them, by participating in their humanity. And again, it's not a foreign thing. It's here. The opportunity is now, and I hope people do get involved in that.
Thanks very much, Jim. How about you? What would you like to tell a Georgetown undergraduate?
Congratulations for getting into Georgetown, because I got rejected to every Jesuit college I applied to. But anyway, but let me just say, we just celebrated the federal holiday honoring Martin Luther King. And one of the things that really sometimes drives me crazy about the way we honor Dr. King is we get together for breakfast, we say nice things, and then we feel like we've checked the box on social justice and civil rights, and then we get on with our lives. And really, I think that does Dr. King's legacy a disservice. Similarly, when I think of Rutilio Grande, if you come to my Washington office, I have posters of Rutilio Grande. I have posters of Archbishop Romero and of the Jesuits who were martyred at the UCA in my personal office and in the Rules Committee. And I do that not just to drive my right-wing colleagues crazy. I do that because I want to be reminded and I want to be inspired by their example. These individuals, Rutilio Grande, meeting with Rutilio Grande, helped, I think, radicalize the church in a very good way, helped radicalize politics in a good way, this absolute commitment to the poor. And basically, it was a call to action. These people get murdered because they did more than talk. They didn't just talk the talk, they walked the walk. It made people uncomfortable. And I really think to the students, today we're living in a country where there's still enormous poverty. We have close to 40 million Americans who don't know where the next meal is going to come from. Voting rights is being assaulted. That's just in the United States. Look at the terrible situation in Central America and in El Salvador. Rising human rights violations, continued poverty, climate crisis, all over the world. And I guess the question is, are we going to talk about it, or are we going to roll up our sleeves and do something about it? I used to have a history professor who used to end every class by saying the same thing. You say, you remember, the world will not get better on its own. And I remember when I took the class, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I do now. I mean, the strides forward that were made in El Salvador. Again, there's still so much to do. Ending the war. I mean, it happened because people came together and demanded that it happen. Ending U.S. military assistance to El Salvador. That happened because people all around the country got involved and pressured their Congress people to actually do something. And I think, you know, I was a history major in college. I wish we had more a sense of history in Congress. But the fact of the matter is, history should be not just something we memorize, it should be something that inspires us and that motivates us to be involved. We can all do amazing things, but we just have to do it. And I'm tired of, and I say this as a, you know, I'm tired of some of my colleagues who are like-minded, who again say nice things, but don't do the hard work. John Lewis told us all to mix it up, to make good trouble. And I think when you read about Rutilio Grande, you see his impact, you see his courage in spite of all that we have learned about his fragility. And it's amazing. You can't help but be inspired by that. And I hope that the students who are listening here, you know, understand that being radicalized is not a bad thing. It means that you're going to be more passionate and energized about actions. And so, I look at these posters on my wall, and I'll be honest with you. There are days I feel like it gets me up and I want to get into the fight. There are other days when I look at it and I feel ashamed that I haven't done enough. And so anyway, let me leave you with that.
Well, I'll tell you, Jim, I think you got a pretty good Jesuit education.
Thank you.
Carolyn, what's your elevator pitch to the undergraduate about why this dusty 50-year-old history matters?
I get to make the elevator pitch all the time at Georgetown, but Jim and I have a mutual friend, Leonel Gomez, the late Leonel Gomez, the man who invited me to El Salvador because he thought poets should see this. Poets needed to be present where people were imperiled. And I used to say to him, I don't understand what I can do. I won't be able to do what you want me to do. I won't be able to talk to Americans about the aid coming to the Salvadoran military. I won't be able to do any of that. And he said, you'd be surprised what an individual can do. And he said, you're going to do it. So he gave me that kind of faith. And one of the things that he used to talk about all the time was immigration. And he said, someday this is going to be very important. And the United States has to do something about immigration. And I didn't really understand what he was talking about until recent years. And what I tell my students now is we're still living there. We're still living in the situation I describe in El Salvador. The people at the border are war refugees. They are refugees of an economic order that was not rectified by the peace accords signed in 1992. There were promises made in those accords that were not ever acted upon, that were not ever implemented. And so because we funded the war, I think as Paco pointed out, to the tune of $1 million a day, we have grave responsibility toward people at the border, regardless of the reasons they give for being there. We owe them a great hospitality and we owe them care. And I believe that is not how this situation is being viewed, of course, but I talk to my students about the present reality, and then we walk it back. We walk it all the way back to those times. And to Rutilio Grande, who believed that he had to make a study of how our economy was constructed, how our social order was constructed. It's not broken, it was built that way, built on decisions made in the halls of Congress and policy decisions. So we have to make that study while we're students, learn as much as we can, and be ready to act on it when we have the chance.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Abel, you are so directly hands-on with so much of the modern day significance of that history that Father Grande was such a part of. What's your elevator pitch to our undergraduates?
Oh, and I've had the opportunity to speak to a lot of Georgetown students, and the incredible resources that Georgetown has probably allows many of the students to learn, right? I think that we can take inspiration from Rutilio, from Monsignor, but I think their greatness was their ordinary life, and that they did not do it alone. And just like myself, that I did not, although I was alive in the era where Rutilio was alive, I didn't connect to him until I was an adult. But once I connected to them, like, your responsibility is to learn their life, because that's where you can model yourself, and you can understand how they are connected to Martin Luther King, to that struggle, to Stephen Biko and that struggle, and realize that again, that you must work towards justice, and that in that work, you don't have to be a martyr. You know, we look at these names because they made the ultimate sacrifice, and history has elevated them, but they didn't do it alone. And we can take so much more from their overall life, not the way they died, but what they did during their life that can guide us, right? So I think for students, it's about keep learning. Don't be satisfied with having a holiday for Martin Luther King, like Congressman McGovern was saying, and then check the box. It's about having that responsibility as a person that is in a higher institution, as a young person, to continue to learn, to be curious about who they were and how you connect them to your life.
Thanks so much, Abo. David, your elevator pitch?
Thing that I would say very briefly is that when we celebrate a man like Rutilio Grande and hold him up, we're saying that there's something extraordinary in a person giving his life for his concern for others. It's the same with the Jesuits assassinated at the Yucca or Archbishop Romero. It's the same with the early church, where martyrdom was a symbol that led to the growth of the church in a very dramatic way. And what is that these martyrs, as they're called, bear witness to? They bear witness to the fact that there's a love that is bigger and stronger than all the threats we face, bigger and stronger even than death. There's something that they have appreciated that made them unafraid to die. They knew. Rutilio Grande knew his life was in danger. He didn't run and hide from that. He kept moving. Now, that's not to say that our lives are in danger in that same way, but there are threats we all face and limitations. And what we can do in that regard is to try to turn back and protect ourselves. Well, they did the opposite. They let go and they turned themselves over and they moved forward. And that kind of hope, that kind of strength that comes from a sense that one has been touched by a love that is even deeper than death is part of what Christianity is all about. I think that's one of the things that means that the martyrs, that people like Rutilio Grande hold up for us, something about the centrality of what Christianity ultimately means. And therefore, I think my pitch would be to say, heroism is not what this is about. There's something about being loved that this is all about, being cared for, being taken care of, even in danger. And that goes beyond heroism. And that's, I think, an important message for us today.
Thank you very much for that, David. I have been looking at the questions that have been coming in. And to be honest, so many of them have in fact already been directly or at least tangentially addressed. All questions about, so many questions about what is Father Grande's life and this era of Salvadoran history have to say to the U.S. society right now. Whose responsibility is it to maintain the legacy of his life and sacrifice? How is he remembered today in the Latino communities? I think I would like, and also mindful of the time, to leave it there, David, with your reminder that his life and death is about an action inspired by an understanding of love. And with that, perhaps bring our panel to conclusion. Carolyn? Oh,
It's okay.
so Carolyn Forche and David Hollenbach and Abel Nunez and Congressman Vargas and Congressman McGovern, a poet, a theologian, a community organizer, and 2 public servants. Thank you all for taking the time to help us mark the beatification of Father Grande and providing so many different perspectives on a common history, but one that we're invited and challenged to make present in our own particular situations today. We've talked about an era, we've talked about a person, and we're talking about its meaningfulness today. Thank you so much for how you've contributed to that for all of us. Thank you also to Catholic Studies for organizing us, and for Berkeley, Latin American Studies, the Americas Institute, Mission and Ministry, all for co-sponsoring this event. To our audience, thank you for coming, for your interest, your listening, your questions and comments. As a reminder, the webinar has been recorded and captioned and will be posted to the events page on Berkeley Center's website for public access soon. And more about Father Grande can be found on Georgetown University's Catholic Studies webpage. Perhaps, and a last word from Father Grande himself, and a word maybe that Father Hollenbach has anticipated. It's a sentence from the homily he delivered at Apopa a month before his assassination. Love is sometimes conflictive and requires a kind of moral violence, not the violence of machetes. That is not our violence. The violence is in the word of God itself, as it challenges us and all society, and at the same time unites us and gathers us together. Our code word is that, love. Love against hatred, love against sin, love against injustice, love against human domination, love against the destruction of human fellowship. That was Father Grande. I'm David Collins. Thank you and have a great afternoon.